this idea that we are the authors and perfecter of the future that is to come is a kind of arrogance that we should reject. And so laughter is an appropriate response to going, I don't know what's going to happen, but I know God's in control. So I'm gonna laugh in the face of that absurdity.
I'm going to be completely honest. I think Christians need to laugh more. Have you ever wondered about that? I'm Paul Brandis, campus pastor at the Shawnee campus.
And I'm Bill Gorman, campus pastor at the Brookside campus. And Paul, I know today's guest on the theFormed.life podcast, Kutter Callaway, agrees with you. Kutter is a returning guest. We first interviewed him on the possibility and place of the genre of horror in the Christian story. And in that interview, he shared if he could do anything besides the good work he already does, he would try his hand at stand-up comedy.
That's right. So we had to have him back on to try out some of his bits on us. Not really, but we did laugh quite a bit on this episode, didn't we, Bill?
Yeah, we sure did. And Dr. Callaway is a professor at Fuller Theological Seminary, where he serves as the William K. Brehm Chair of Worship, Theology, and the Arts, Associate Dean of the Center for Advanced Theological Studies, and Associate Professor of Theology and Culture.
Yeah, it was so great to have him back, and it was a really fun conversation. Let's dive in now. Well, Dr. Callaway, thanks so much for taking time to come back on the theFormed.life podcast. We loved having you on last season to talk about the possibility and place of the genre of horror in the story and people of God. And that was such an interesting and fun conversation. We couldn't help but have you back on. So thank you for making the time.
Well, thank you for inviting me back. That means that the problem is we're recording this before that episode's come out. So that's why I agreed. You have no evidence, hard evidence as to why you should never invite me back. So
that's right. We haven't gotten all the angry emails yet.
That's right. Exactly.
No, we're very excited. We're actually recording this a couple days before it drops, and we scheduled it to be on Halloween. So, but partly why we got you back to record so quickly, we always ask a question at the end of every episode. So we have regular listeners. It's a get to know you question, and we ask if you could do anything else other than the amazing work you get to do, what would it be? And your answer, we've always loved this question, but your answer was stand-up comedian. So that jumped out at us because we have been wondering about an episode almost kind of similar about the genre of comedy, or just even more broadly, not necessarily like the genre of it within particular content, but just humor and laughter and the place of that, the topic of humor in God's story and humor within God's people. And when you answered that after we logged off, I asked you why that was your answer. And we kept talking after the first podcast wrapped up. And I was like, oh my gosh, we got to have Dr. Callaway back. So truly, thanks for doing that. And we asked you this kind of last time about horror, but what's your story related to comedy and humor? And would just love to hear why you're also interested and passionate about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, when you guys told me you might ask this question, I was like, what is the answer to that? Part of me wonders, like, if I'm funny at all. I don't know. I like to think of myself as basically I'm just silly. At the end of the day, my humor is not much more advanced than like an 8th grade boy. Like that's still, I laugh at things that an 8th grade boy would laugh at. But I think like looking back, there's some, and we can get into this in terms of the theology side of it that I find interesting.
We'd love to. Yeah.
I had a pretty medically tense emergence into life, and had spinal meningitis and some other early sicknesses. I was in the NICU for first, basically, in and out of ER and the hospital for the first couple of years of my life. And obviously don't have like a conscious memory of this, but have some like pictures and other things. And one is this like image I have because there's this dates me a little bit, but I was on a local show called the Texas Country Reporter, which is like, a little news slice of life thing. And they went into the children's hospital where I was at. And the time I was there, they had to put the IV in my head. I think I was a little under 2. And they put IVs there so that because kids would pull them out of their arms. But then to have me not mess with it, they taped like a styrofoam cup on top of my hat. And my mom said, according to my mom, she said, you look like a little bellhop. And I was like, and apparently, so I'm like, what? And so apparently, I also was kind of a jokester as like a 2-year-old. The nursing staff would come in, and I was making them laugh. Again, I don't totally remember this, but that story, like I have a picture, an actual photograph of the TV show. Oh, wow. Is the picture I've got when I was on it. So I don't have like a tape or anything, but that image plus the sort of story that I think my mom and parents have told was really interesting to me, because my personality is such that it seems like in times and in contexts that are like pretty treacherous, right? Like it's like you get this kid suffering from a potentially fatal issue. He's making people laugh, and there's things that come with that, right? Like it alleviates tension. It helps us sort of like get outside of what could be an otherwise really sort of despairing situation. Yeah. And I just have that kind of infused in my imagination of who I am. The problem is, of course, it's a lot of pressure to put on yourself to go like, I'm going to be funny, like for anybody that's, right. I'm sure like actual stand-up comedians or whatever, like say something funny, and it's like, well, I can't do that. So I think that's the origin of it, but I'm also second born. So of 5 kids, so I worked on pastoral staff at this one church for a while, and our executive pastor, he totally nailed me this one time, because we were greeting people one Sunday morning, and I did something. I don't even know what it was. And he goes, "You remind me a lot of my second born." I'm like, "How so?" And he's like, "You do anything for a look or a laugh." And I was like, at first I was like, "You take that back." And then I realized I was like, "Oh, that's absolutely right." Like I just, so much of what I do, I'm just trying to like get a reaction out of my older sister or, whatever. So there's something about that, that's just in me. So that's kind of I would say the origin of it. The last kind of thing and this is where we talked about on the last podcast, where it has more recently come up. I've long been just in awe of stand-up comedians in terms of like the craft. As younger, I loved Jerry Seinfeld, but I even like the Eddie Murphys of the world, their stand-up. I will say this cautiously, but Bill Cosby's stand-up was fantastic. Like his stuff is amazing. That's all I'll say about Bill Cosby. But I always just admired people's ability to go into a place with otherwise strangers and like have something planned that you pretty much know is going to make people laugh hysterically. And I'm like, wow, that skill set is not something I have, because I'm more I say I'm a dabbler in relational comedy, which means you have to know me to find me funny. And the benefit of that is if you don't, that's on you, right? Like it's your fault. Exactly, it's your fault if you don't find me funny. So this idea that people that wouldn't know me, I could craft something that would find funny. I thought that's really interesting and would be a really helpful like communication tool. Similar to being in a hospital, you go, I'm in these public speaking roles as a pastor, as a professor, whatever, of saying, man, if I could be strategic about how to disarm people through laughter, I'd really love to learn more about what that is like. And I just don't feel good at it. I'm so bad at it. And that's more recently kind of where it's come of like, I'd really love to kind of dive into what makes people funny, what is funny, and how can I learn from people that are really hilarious to inform some of the stuff that I do in my day-to-day life?
Yeah. It's so interesting.
Well, and when you sort of think about, a couple of things are coming to mind. So when you think about what makes things or people funny, I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on that. I remember reading C.S. Lewis early on, as I was probably in college, and him pointing out that like kind of at the heart of humor is incongruence, that you find things that are incongruent in life. And that's what makes us what makes us laugh? You're expecting one thing and you get another. So there's this element of incongruence. So is that part of what you've found in that, or what would you add to that?
You're expecting the 2-year-old that's in the hospital to be laying in the bed.
That's right.
Sick. Yeah. And then you walk in and he looks like a bellhop and he's doing a routine.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, there's incongruence. Yeah.
And I think that's right. I think there's incongruence because it's also incongruence in sort of social norms, right? Mm-hmm. Like you're not supposed to laugh at a kid in a hospital bed. Right. But if he just patently looks silly, like that's funny. Like, oh, that's a funny thing. And then when you add visual elements to it, right? Like if you describe it as you go, you look like a bellhop, right? So there's another incongruence. Like what? Now you're imagining a tiny little bellhop sitting in it. Like there's multiple different layers, I think, of incongruence. I think that's right. That's part of it. And so, and that could spin out in a few different ways. One would be more like surprise or misdirection, right? Like I didn't see it. But it also has to, I think, land on the incongruence has to start with something that's sort of shared. A lot of like setups to jokes are, anybody in the room have kids? Right. Anybody in the room? Actually, I almost sent this to my wife and then I didn't today. But it was a stand-up comedian. He's like, I'm married. And he's like, anybody else married? Yeah. And he's like, actually, that's not really people. You can't really use the language of married. That's inappropriate anymore. He's like, I'm, what did he say? I'm going to mess it up. But it's something like, I'm sexually impaired. He's like, I'm not married. I'm sexually impaired. And so he went on to talk about being married and having sex with like his driving spots, right? So you go, okay, everybody who's married, right? Like you're familiar with that. We've got some common ground. And then you start going sexually impaired. Even that, it's like misdirection, but it's also a common thing, right? Like this man's frustration with being married and yet being sexually frustrated, right? So even that is this commonality that you're building, and that I think is really hilarious when you kind of see the world and the absurdity of it that you share in common with other people. Yeah. And then you start going like, oh yeah, my own situation itself is kind of laughable if I stop and reflect on it a little bit. So yeah, I think that's right. You want me to say more about what I think is funny? Yeah. I mean, there's also what I personally find funny, and then what might be generally funny. One interesting thing about comedy, I think, is also like the example I just used. It's got to push certain sort of boundaries and flirt with boundaries in certain ways. Otherwise, it's usually not very funny, right? You could go like, oh, I could see how that's humorous, but rarely are you reflexively like guffawing or laughing out loud if it's like a really safe, contained, predictable kind of a joke. Sure. And so I think that's one of the interesting things about comedy is it, knowing who your audience is, knowing kind of where their boundaries are set, and then some of the unexpected incongruence is kind of like brushing up against those boundaries in ways that are safe and humorous, but not, and that's the danger, but not crossing certain lines, right? Like there's certain times where, I mean, and maybe we've all seen it, whether it's a movie or stand-up comedy or whatever, and you go like, ooh, that was one step too far, right? Like, and you get that, more you get the cringe sound instead of the laugh, the like, ugh. So that I think is really fascinating. It could be similar to incongruence, but is part of, I think, the craft, right? The art of it is finding where that is, kind of right-sizing that. And it's also right now why people, Seinfeld is a good example. He and some others have been lamenting essentially cancel culture as erecting these lines, these uncrossable lines that will get you canceled. And a lot of the comedians right now are going, but that's our whole thing. Like our whole thing is crossing lines. Like how, if I can't make fun of X, then where does comedy stand anymore? And so that's a pretty interesting, I think, just societal conversation we're having now, but it's definitely part of what makes certain things funny.
It is interesting. I'm a huge Seinfeld fan, as the show Seinfeld, as well as his stand-up. And it's interesting to sometimes go back and watch old episodes of Seinfeld and think like they would not write that joke on network television today. That would not, that line or that bit or that storyline would not be on TV today.
Well, that you watch early episodes of The Office. You watch, I was just international flight last week, and I watched The Hangover. I don't know if you remember the first one. And I was like, oh man, like some of the things that I'm like, this would not be made today. Some for very good reasons. Right.
I was going to add that in too. So there's probably some goodness to some of that.
Exactly.
Yes.
And others for reasons where you go, well, wait a minute.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we're at, of trying to figure out, discerning what are the times where you go, yeah, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't joke about that. And that's a good, for me, the other thing I remember about my mom, this thing she taught me or told me about my humor was she would always say something like, Kutter, sometimes your jokes hurt. And I was like, oh, and so it was part of her way of saying, like, we love you being funny. It's important, but not if it's coming at somebody's expense, if it's painful or causes harm, because the power of it producing laughter is equally powerful and really doing some severe harm. And I think that's why in terms of U.S. society, it's landing on comedians, because man, those jokes, they're not just jokes. Like they can do something really damaging. And it might be why we're having these conversations about comedians, because of that.
Well, and it's, just a time mapping. It is, because you can kind of name Seinfeld as like, oh, that's, you watch some of that, but it's like, oh, that was the 80s and the 90s. But the first season of The Office was 2005. I think The Hangover was like 2010. So you're talking about a more rapid shift and change in the last 10 to 15 years in our cultural conversation around this. And I too have been fascinated by like you're saying, the broader societal conversation around this, but then I'm like, hey, where are the Christians at in this conversation? Because I'm fascinated by that too, and incorporating our ethic within the middle of it. And I think you're really hitting on something, humor. We would have a Christian would say part of why, and your mom, it's like part of why we should never use humor to harm is because of our ethic of love, and how that would be opposed to sort of the way of Jesus. I'm convinced Jesus was hilarious. I think there's no way he wasn't, right? But I'm also convinced that he never once harmed in the midst of his use of humor. So yeah.
Well, it's like my current favorite comedian, and I mean, this is like saying I like, ice cream, is Nate Bargatze.
Oh, of course. That's too.
Yeah. I'm like,
we're going to get along real well.
Yeah. He and I are the exact same age. And so he and I, some of his jokes about growing up with 90s Christian parents.
Yep. Yes.
Like
The
most Christian, thing. I'm like, yep, that's right.
They're more Christian than Jesus.
Yes, exactly. He's like, oh man. So, but what I love about his comedy, and he's, from what I understand, a pretty openly Christian person, but and is known for having it. What people talk about it as if he has clean comedy, which he does. It's clean, but it's not just clean. It's actually it's loving, right? Yes. Like it's empathetic. Yes. There's nobody in his stories that end up being beat down. He is self-deprecating. That's part of the fun of it. And that's the kind of humor I think I like the most. Either that or just absurdist humor. But I bet Jesus was pretty self-deprecating, right?
Yeah, totally.
Well, he was ultimately self-deprecating.
Right. Yes, theologically, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, but exactly. So I think he's doing that. Nate is embodying what I would think is, and I don't want to like put sainthood on Nate Bargatze, but he really does, I think, model what a Christian approach to comedy is. And right now, how compelling that is, right? Like it's interesting that of all that's out there, why is right now he's been doing comedy for like 30 years, and then it's over just the last 3 to 5 that he's just skyrocketed.
Yeah, in popularity,
Yeah, and I think people are really hungry for that kind of way of being in the world.
Well, and it is really, like, to your point about how the people in his stories don't come off as being thrown under the bus. Like, the way he does that is threading a needle. Like, some of the ways he like still honors his wife, but tells hilarious stories about the two of them. It's like, man, that is, to your point about the craft and the precision that some of that takes. It's just, but it's so relatable, but there's incongruence. It's like,
Well, and I wonder if there's something about the gospel that allows us to, and Christians haven't always been good at this because we haven't always deeply internalized the good news of the gospel. But if you know that you're ultimately secure, if your identity is in Jesus, it'll actually allows you to not take yourself too seriously.
Right.
Yeah.
Actually, one of our staff cultural habits at Christ Community is we take the mission seriously, but not ourselves. And we try to just remind ourselves we can laugh and we can laugh at ourselves because ultimately, like, we are secure in his love. And so when we do something dumb, when we make a mistake, when whatever, we don't have to be uptight about that or try to cover that up or whatever. We can just laugh. And
in a benediction, like last month, I said, and I didn't realize it, but it's on the live stream. I said Apostle Petus. It just kept right on coasting. And it wasn't until my staff pointed it out later that week that I realized, but we've got it if we want to link to it in the show notes. Apostle Petus.
Yeah.
It's pretty good.
No, I think you're right. I mean, biblically, all the times where there's a Psalms or Proverbs of laughter, there's all these different kinds, right? There's one of the kinds of laughter is laughing in the face of whatever is to come. And that is part of to admit I'm not in control of that, right? Like, I know there's some other agency out there that is actually controlling what's to come. So I can kind of laugh at the absurdity of it all. I can laugh at even what people might be imagining. We could talk right now, right? We're on less than 2 weeks out from the U.S. election, and some people are very serious about this, and might even say it's not an appropriate time to laugh. And you go, actually, from a Christian perspective, it's exactly the time to laugh. One, there is just literally lots of absurd, hilarious things going on that are laughable. But two, this idea that we, either as individuals or even like as political agents, are the authors and perfecter of the future that is to come, is a kind of arrogance that we should reject. Laughter is an appropriate response to going, I don't know what's going to happen on November 5th, but I know God's in control, so I'm gonna laugh in the face of that absurdity. So, well,
and there's that great Psalm 2 reality where the nations are kind of conspiring, and God is laughing at them. And like you think you've got this, you think you can control all this, and he's laughing, which is what allows us to laugh.
Yep.
Well, so thinking more about even the Bible and humor, is there a particular story or passage that comes to your mind that strikes you as particularly funny, or one that, I just am curious, as you've read God's word over the years, what have you laughed at?
So I grew up in the Texas in Baptist churches, which means we had Sunday night church, which is its own kind of torture. Because, and I never got it. Like, we had Sunday morning, we did all that stuff. Wednesday we had youth group and stuff, but Sunday night it was like distilled down to the worst elements of what we were doing. And that's just some guy getting up and droning on for an hour. So I remember the only thing I could do that we're forced to sit there is like thumb through, you either had the hymnal or the Bible in the back of the pews. It's pre-cell phones or anything, like, so you're a teenager or whatever, you have nothing to do but sit there. Felt like eternity. So I would just thumb through looking at either the naughty sections of the Bible or the hilarious sections, right? And sometimes those are the same, often. And so there's some nice mix to me of hilarious parts of the Bible that usually have to do, once again, the humor of an 8th grade boy. I find Elijah mocking the prophets of Baal pretty funny, because it's not just you might be asleep, but you might be on the toilet. So it's like, he's on the toilet. Jehud and Judges, right? The fat king and the knife, and he's on the toilet. He's like, they don't find him for a while because so any toilet-based humor I thought was pretty funny.
Okay, I want to stop right there because we also have, what's so interesting about this, if we've also talked about that as a you can read that from a horror lens as well.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Right.
For those who go listen to Be Afraid, the Be Afraid podcast, I think it's the intro episode. It's either we did like a short intro episode and then episode 1. It's one of those that the whole lead in is I rewrite the Jehud story as like a slasher film. Yeah, right. And I go, actually, this isn't, this is actually from the Bible. And this podcast isn't about, toilet humor. It's about horror, So even then in the horror thing, we're kind of playing tongue in cheek and saying it's both graphic and grotesque and funny.
Right. Yeah. Right.
And because, human bowel movements are funny. I mean,
you just can't get away from it.
Yeah. Like again, Jesus probably was hilarious. It's like him and a bunch of dudes just hanging out in the middle of nowhere. Like the amount of fart jokes they probably had, I just can't conceive the kind of things that they were probably joking about. But similarly, and this I actually had to look up because I need to do a little bit more research, but I'm pretty sure. So one of Solomon's sons, this is one of my favorite bits. The translation you look at is different, but you go, wow, that's in the Bible and it's funny. And you think about it in its context and it would have been funny. And it's even funny now. Rehoboam comes into power and then he's asking his advisors, right? Like, what should I do? And they're like, tell him your pinky is bigger than your dad's waist, which is not his waist, right? His lower quarters. And I'm going, what? Like, one, that's an awesome burn. Two, it's in the Bible. Yep. And then 3, he was using it as like to beat down all these. I mean, like that's pretty hilarious. Yeah. But the one part that I think is pretty funny that I've said in other contexts, and we can get to this about why maybe Christians aren't always funny, is at Pentecost, right? So you have everyone speaking in tongues. Oh, yes. Yeah. And then I think it's Peter gets up and addresses everyone and is like, because the crowd thinks they're drunk. Yes. And he's like, these men are drunk. It's only 9 o'clock in the morning. And I go, because if it was 9 at night, they would have been drunk. Like what? Right, like so, I like that, and that's one of those. Not incongruity and a sort of misdirection, right? Yes. It feels like it's a setup. You would think he would go, these men aren't drunk. They're clearly drunk on the Holy Spirit. But no, he said, the reason is, well, it's only 9. And I find that pretty funny.
I had a seminary professor who pointed out that he knew what time the bars opened.
Exactly. If it were 3 p.m., it'd
be an open question. But
exactly.
Those are great examples.
And even that, right, it calls out back to taking ourselves too seriously, because the suggestion that maybe all the disciples or people there were flawed, failed people who might have shown up at happy hour later that day. Right. It's like, that's silly, right? We're prone to hypocrisy, and calling that out, we need to laugh at ourselves. That is a reality. And doing it in a funny way is disarming, I think, in some helpful ways. So one last thing, another one that came to mind. And this is back to where it doesn't always, I can't plan it always well, but I was preaching on various handful of texts, most recently at a church that was guest preaching. And I talked about how I read scripture differently. Well, we all do at different ages. And as the father of adolescents, like I can't help but hear Jesus as like an adolescent, especially when he's interacting with his parents. So, his mom comes at the feast at Cana and she's like, we're out of wine. And he's like, it's not my time, mother. And I just I now find that interaction funny and hilarious, because I'm thinking like, that's such an adolescent move of being like, your mom is like stressed out coming to help. And they're like, I don't want to help, Mom. And so that's not in there, but I now find that kind of funny.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. That's so good. Yeah.
Well, and I wonder too, as I've thought about, we've talked about there's different kind of genres of humor, just as there are different kind of genres of horror.
Yeah, which we talked about. Yeah.
Yeah. I know you're working with a doctoral student there at Fuller who's looking at the book of Job kind of through the lens of some dark humor, which I'm fascinated. I've worked with her in the Writing Center. She's helping me with my writing, but I always ask her about her project because I just find it so fascinating. And I wonder what you've learned just even from her reading her work, interacting with her around those kind of dark humor themes in a book like Job, where you think, well, if there's one place in the Bible it's not funny, it's the book of Job. But she's looking at it through that lens.
Yeah. I mean, there's what's interesting about when we say humor. Yeah. There's all sorts of different kinds, different genres. Dark humor is one, satire is one. And the prophets themselves often deployed satirical humor
100%
in the way they were either talking about false gods, about Israel and its sort of abandonment of God's will for their lives, and so there's something that you leverage the power of humor that could be that sort of cutting people down, and yet you're aiming it in an appropriate direction, right? Like you're saying, I'm doing this on purpose because mocking you is the only thing you're going to hear, right? Like that you, because it is, I mean, I think any of us, if anybody was bullied or had were ganged up on it at school, and be one thing if people said, you're a terrible person or you're a loser, that's okay. But if they laughed at you, that's, there's, at least for me, there's something that's just, ooh, that cuts deep.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's happening with satire. With the dark humor though, it's kind of this inverse. So, I mean, in Job, you also have these places where laughter is actually promised to Job as well. So it's interesting that like God's saying, I'm going to fill your mouth with laughter, right? And then what I think your lips with shouting, right? So there's, and that language shows up throughout the Old Testament in the way that God talks about, say, bringing people out of the wilderness, the return of the temple, of the exiles, et cetera. There's always this, I'm going to, turn your mourning into dancing, your weeping into laughter. And so laughter is a part of it, but the dark comedy in it, I think is this other reality of comedy that's just very human, which is a lot of it starts in and is an exploration of deep wounds and pain. If you listen to any, outside of their stand-up, if you listen to interviews with most comedians, a lot of them are actually doing comedy as self-consciously as a way to deal with a lot of the darkness and pain in their life.
Yes.
And the more I've kind of poked into it, I'm I'm sure it's not every single comedian, maybe some just, but a lot of them are going, yeah, I had a really rough childhood or a really rough experience, whatever. And I responded by doing funny things. Right. And I continue to do that. And so the dark comedy, I think, is a way of, whether it's in Job or just in life in general, of us going, there's something about now that calls for this kind of, what seems like a counterintuitive response.
Yeah.
But I have no other, it's I have no other option. It's similar to, well, maybe not similar. The instinct, I guess, the impulse is similar to if you are in a horror film and something horrible happens and people laugh. I don't know if you've ever been in that where an audience, it's either nervous laughter or they laugh and it's what we're watching is not funny. Nothing about what we just saw is funny, but we're laughing because it's other than screaming or something. We don't have another choice. So I think that's part of what the dark comedy gets at. It's one, how do we think about laughter and humor as a way to explore, express, recognize the pain that we experience. And then also this kind of odd reflexive thing that sometimes it's just, we don't know what else to do with ourselves because the pain is painful. The horror is horrible. And I think maybe, is that where it came up initially for the horror conversation, where we're this sort of jumping out of your seat and laughing are similar kind of reflexive impulses?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. My dad was a police officer for 25 years, and I do chaplaincy work with police officers today. And that is a group of people, and I think first responders generally, who, if you are not part of that community, you would think these people are laughing at things that are really dark and inappropriate, but it is one of the only coping mechanisms when you see these kinds of scenes and you see these kind of things. It's like, if you're going to keep going back to work the next day, you got to be able to kind of laugh about some of the stuff that they call them normies, people outside of that community be like, I cannot believe that you just made a joke about this, but it's like, but that's the only way I'm going to keep going in this work.
Well, and it's the cliche too of, it's like, we got to laugh or we're going to cry, not that crying would be wrong, but that cliche births up out of something that is, I think, similar to what we're discussing. So, but why in your thinking and experience, why don't Christians laugh more? I mean, I'm just curious, what are we missing? What steps could we take to better integrate healthy, comedy into the people of God?
I think there's lots of reasons, and it may not be everybody. I'm sure there are some Christians and communities that have very healthy approaches to comedy, and they're laughing all the time. Part of it, I think, gets at what you just brought up, and that is, there are in life, there are these what I would call limit experiences, right? You're brought to the end of yourself, and if you're a first responder constantly, it's like I am confronted daily with the end of my ability to control, to explain, to whatever the horror that I'm encountering. And laughter is kind of that admission that it's beyond me, right? I don't, and I actually wouldn't have the capacity to keep getting up every day and doing it if I didn't acknowledge that, right? For whatever reason, as Christians, and maybe just any sort of theist who's trying to go how do I make sense of the world? There is a way that we, I think, often operate and think, and that is that our faith is actually the thing that helps us control and contain life. And so we don't let ourselves get to those limited experiences because it reveals to us, once again, we're not in control, right? I'm not in control. We know that, we would say, oh, of course God is in control. But in some ways we use God, we use Christianity to control, as opposed to say, this is my sort of walking into a relationship with the one who is in control, right? So I think that's part of it. The other part, I want to say, it's like any society or whatever, a religious community is defined by certain boundaries, right? We set up certain things that we go, I'm a part of this family, a part of this tribe, and here are the kind of things that are involved in that, right? The kind of commitments that I'm making. And I think at times, as we've all said, there are certain commitments where those, we need to hold to those. You don't need to, it's dangerous to play with those boundaries. And there's been 2,000 years of history of us seeing people play with those boundaries and then, go poorly. But there's this other set of boundaries that we start creating, right? And here's where you can get sort of Pharisaical or whatever. All of a sudden, it's the rules on top of the rules on top of the rules that are really used, once again, to legislate and control. And I think we just are really uncomfortable playing with those boundaries. And if comedy does require the playing with those boundaries, it's just not something that as a community we're all that accustomed to doing. There's not really any other places where that's appropriate. And so you get all of this, these sort of norms that go into play where it's you don't laugh at that sort of thing, right? What I would love to do with this next podcast season, if we do one on comedy, is I think I told you all this. I want to do a pastor's confessional, and it can be anonymous. And I'm I want you to call and blur your voice, whatever, and then just share the funniest thing from your pastoral experience that you weren't allowed to laugh at. Because what's usually the funniest is you're in a context where this, I shouldn't be laughing. I can't laugh. I'm not allowed to laugh, right. But it is hilarious. And that makes it even more funny. Right. And I think that's in play quite a lot. And then maybe the last thing, I'm sure there's more, but as I've just been kind of thinking through, I do think that we tend to take ourselves too seriously, right? That at the end of the day, we do assume a lot more responsibility for things. It's similar to the control thing. But we do think quite a lot of ourselves and it becomes difficult, I think, to be self-deprecating, to be kind of admitting that, you know what, I'm the first among equals when it comes to silliness and being foolish and saying dumb things and making mistakes. And even though I think that's baked into what, you look at Paul, he was read on the one hand, he's I'm going to be insane for a second, he tells him. And I'm the best of everybody. And then he's like, actually, I'm the chief of all sinners. Like, that's me. And so it's in our tradition that we should be open to it, but I think we actually struggle with that. We tend to create systems and structures and communities where we're privileging this sort of self-importance, and I'm a serious, Christian, and that self-deprecating, man, I'm a chief among sinners is just, it's difficult because it does take some self-confidence to say, I'm dumb. I didn't get it right. And look how foolish I am. That is hard to do as a practice, I think.
Yeah. And again, I think that's when you do get that kind of gospel identity rooted so deeply in you, you're able to say, yeah, I'm just a screw up sometimes, and that's okay. Because that does not affect my status in relationships that is most important in my true identity. But so often I think that seriousness, and this is coming from someone who for most of my life is probably, both Paul and I are like serious. You're not that serious, but like we're firstborns, so we got that firstborn kind of, at least for me, kind of, you do everything right. You follow the rules. And so as someone who's recovering from that and finding a sort of a true identity, a deeper identity in Jesus, it is so much easier to laugh when it's like, I don't have to, if I'm living before an audience of one and I don't have to impress anybody, then it is a lot easier to laugh at yourself in the midst of that. So, yeah.
Well, when you were last on, we talked about certain segments of the horror genre that even as we, in some ways, were encouraging Christians to potentially engage that genre a little more directly, but we still talked about certain types of horror on the whole that might be better to avoid, and wonder, thinking similarly for followers of Jesus, engaging like content, whether again on an Instagram feed or a television show or certain movies or certain comedians. Do you have any certain similar frameworks for that? Like that, hey, and this might just be, or this is going to clearly cross some of those boundaries that we know there's a lack of wisdom in crossing those boundaries. So I wondered about a similar question for, especially as listeners are thinking about content choices and knowing that is an area of freedom, but what advice you have there? Yeah.
It actually probably would be pretty similar. So see episode, fill in the blank. But because it's sort of my criteria for just media consumption, just in general. Right. But when it comes to comedy in particular, I think we've addressed a few of them. One, I do think there needs to be, not that it's, going to be horribly destructive in certain ways, but especially if you habitually engage with comedy that is, I would just call it punching down, right? So I went to, Netflix is a Joke had a big thing here in LA maybe 3 or 4 months ago, and I went to I will not name the person's name, and actually he is a person that is in the sort of Christian space, but is also very crass and anyway. And love the whole set, but they had American Sign Language, ASA interpreters there for the set, right? Which was really interesting. And early on, you could tell that the stand-up comedians hadn't always worked with interpreters and people doing sign language on stage with them, and so some of the things they were saying were like, wait, how are you signing this, right? And so it kind of became a playful interaction. But didn't it, at one point, it sort of shifted. And again, this is it's not exactly, it's hard to say, but it almost became like the people doing the sign language were being made fun of. And the person was getting the audience to laugh at them, as opposed to we're all laughing together about how awkward it would be, because again, they have to sign what the people are saying. And some of the things they're saying were pretty crass, and they thought that was funny, which it is. But then it's like, ooh, and so I'm going, and I stopped and I was like, this isn't funny. This isn't, and it's not cool, man. And so there's plenty of examples of that, where it's like, oh, your humor now is, again, it's punching down. It's making fun of someone instead of encouraging people to laugh. And I think that's where it's just, the the tongue is a two-edged sword, right? Like that it can be a really harmful thing. So I think that's one. The other, I've been thinking a little bit. I mean, one is just like there are some that are just crass for crass sakes, right? Like it's just I'm not super that. Actually, I feel a lot of times for some of the female stand-up comics, I feel like sometimes they feel pressured to be as crass as the male comics often are, and I'm like, your humor doesn't need that, right? Like I'm like, it's actually not helping make what you're saying funnier, and in some cases, I'm not liking it. But there's a lot of like male stand-up comics where I'm just like, you're just doing toilet humor. There's no redemptive part. Although I like toilet humor, I just want to be on the record. Some of it's very funny. Maybe I should say similar to horror film, like, right? A psychological thriller, I think we talked about this, is when you use scary elements to tell a story, and then horror is often you tell a story to scare people. Yeah. Part of me would think like, if you can use toilet humor as a part of a larger trajectory or story, fine. If the entire thing you're doing is just toilet humor, it's like, well, what's the point of that, right? It's also artistically a little bankrupt because I'm like, literally, 8-year-old boys are doing that. So, why would I pay to go see,
Right. Two of them live in my home.
Exactly. So, again, it can make you chuckle, but do I want to like consume that as a thing? The last thing, and I don't know how to exactly say this, so this is a work in progress, but this comes with the kind of humor that's emerged recently. And a lot of it is in this sort of like the echo chambers of Web 2.0 and social media, where it reminds me a lot of Proverbs, of sort of the laughing of fools, that there's a kind of laughter of fools that is hard to always identify, but there is something where it's like, you're not actually creating humor. You're not bringing joy and delight. You're not, empathizing with common plights with other people and drawing attention to the absurdity. You are kind of like laughing at your own sort of impoverished way of seeing the world, and finding it funny in part, in some cases, because it offends people, right? Like, because, it's like sticking it to the other side or something like that. And you go and you're delighting in it. And I think that kind of comedy is on the rise. Like, there is almost a delight in how offensive your position is to other people, that I'm going, that's problematic. And so I think I would say for Christians going, if you find yourself, and especially that, because comedy can be it involves you in very specific ways because you're laughing at it. You're laughing with them. You're laughing at the person. When you find yourself delighting in those things, I think that's the sort of alarm bell of going like, ooh, what am I being invited to delight in, and at whose expense? And, am I still loving my neighbor as I do that? I think would be some of the discernment criteria for me.
It's really helpful.
Yeah, it's really good. Well, and you kind of alluded to this earlier that maybe you're going to work on, just like you did that horror series with Christianity Today, maybe something around humor. And so I just wonder, if as you continue to think about that, prepare for that, maybe what are some resources that you'd recommend to our listeners if you want to, whether it's something they can listen to, watch, read, that might be helpful, if they want to think more deeply and more Christianly about what it means to laugh and humor, what would you recommend? Yeah.
Well, there's not a ton, is one thing. Like, there's not a big well of resources on Christians and humor,
which is part of why I wanted to do this episode. I feel the gap in that, and part of our whole goal with this is for our church community, but more broadly, to bring some thoughtful formation, some thoughtful spiritual formation to these topics. So thank you for helping us.
Oh, sure. And hopefully there will be more as things sort of progress. I would say one kind of starting point, and it's actually my PhD mentor, a guy named Rob Johnston. He did his early doctoral work that ended up becoming a book that you can get called A Theology of Play. It's either theology of play or Christians at play. The Christian at play. That's what it is. And I think comedy is a part of thinking about what does playfulness look like, and how do we think about playfulness? He doesn't specifically focus on comedy, but in terms of like a theological approach to kind of playful things, and that could include going to see movies, going to a play, playing, being in a softball league or so, all of that's involved, I think, in this. So that'd be one place I would start. There's a couple other, a guy named Terry Lindvall has written actually on really more on the history of film, but he also has a few things. It's focused a little bit more on comedy and film, but he offers some a historical take and then a little bit kind of a Christian theology of comedic film, which is pretty helpful. So look at Terry Lindvall. And then there's a couple others. There's a couple just books that people can maybe look at. One is called Jews and Humor by a guy named Leonard Greenspoon. And he kind of goes through, like we've mentioned, multiple Jewish comedians, so Seinfeld, et cetera. A lot of Hollywood films written, directed, starring, Jewish actors and directors. And so a kind of, back to Job, like the kind of humor that comes from a people group that have experienced the worst of the worst over and over and over and over. And yet they have this like core comedic sensibility that has really kind of shaped, especially North American West. So that's a good one. And then one I've been recommended, I haven't personally read yet, but it looks good. Steve Wilkins wrote a book, What's So Funny About God? A Theological Look at Humor. Okay. That was recommended to me. I haven't gotten it yet, but from my brief kind of glance at it, looks like a pretty good one. So I'd start there.
Super helpful.
Yeah. And then we just need to make more stuff. Like we need to make more resources for folks to think about this, especially in a time, and let's just talk about the U.S. context, like as with Nate Bargatze blowing up, I'm going, if there's a time for the church to be funny, intentionally and strategically, now is it. We need a little joy and a little delighting and a little laughter, for goodness sake.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
It's really good.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Callaway. And it's as a repeat guest, we already got your answer that we ask all of our guests about you get to do some amazing work. What else would you do? It's part of what led to us inviting you back. So I wanted to ask instead, just when in your life do you remember laughing the absolute hardest? And what was it that got you going? And that's maybe a hard question to ask as you think back over the course of your life. But so what's one instance that comes to mind?
Well, it's semi-recent because thinking about it longer, I'm like, well, I know there were times this happened, but I couldn't remember the exact occasion, right? But I'm pretty sure most of them had to do with times where you were trying to suppress laughter.
Yes, that does
and like you just couldn't stop, you're like, oh, and then it like starts catching. But I do more recently this, Pastor's Confidential idea. I was at out of town visiting another place and ended up at a campfire with a group of folks I didn't know. They just like, hey, want to come over? And it ended up being a handful of pastors from a local church and then kind of their small group. I'm like, oh, okay. So I'm like, hey, what do you all think about this? And would you like call in and have funny stories? And so people started, and then it starts snowballing. Right. So they kind of started sharing stories, and we're just like on the floor laughing around a campfire. But I remember the sort of peak moment was, and this gets at the boundary crossing, the you can't laugh in these situations, the you can't make this stuff up kind of thing. Right. So one of the pastors there, I won't even say the name or the place because it'll be too, maybe this has happened more than once. But pretty large church in this area. And this pastor had I think 4 or 5 kids and is like talking to his wife, okay, we got to get the vasectomy. It has to happen. And so he's like, but I need to go schedule something in this town an hour away because the odds of me running is I don't want, and his wife's like, what? You're crazy. Don't worry about that. And he was worried, but then kind of forgot about it and ends up scheduling it. And sure enough, in his town. And so he goes through all the sort of early appointment stuff, no problem. But it's not until the day of the surgery, and according to him, he's like sitting on the, laying on the bed, a hospital gown open, sort of legs up, ready for the procedure, and he hears, and I'm not going to use his real name, but like, Pastor Johnny. It's a female nurse who's there as the aide, who's one of his congregants coming in, and she's like, "How are you doing?" And I'm about to operate on, help operate on you. And he's like, I've never, I still to this day cannot look her in the eye. And I avoid, I go around the church, and I'm just like, yeah, so that was the last story. And we're just falling over ourselves laughing of how crazy and absurd and only in that scenario, only a pastor would be able to share that crazy story.
That's amazing.
But it was a pretty funny night. We laughed a lot that night.
So good.
Thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah. Well, again, thanks for taking this time with us. And we've mentioned a number of different resources, links to other podcasts, that kind of things. We will put all of those in the show notes so that you can access those. And we're just really grateful for you, Kutter, and the work that you're doing. And for all of you who are listening, watching, thanks for joining us on this episode of the Formed.life podcast.
Thanks a bunch.